Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak about a subject that I know is dear to the presiding officer's heart, and that is the sorry state of our campaign finance system and the need for the DISCLOSE Act of 2012, we call DISCLOSE 2.0. The Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission opened the floodgates to unlimited corporate and special interest money in our elections, bringing about an era in which corporations and other wealthy interests can drown out the voices of individual voters in our political system. Worse still, much of this spending is anonymous, so we don't even know who is spending millions to influence our elections. Here's how my home state newspaper, the Providence Journal, explained it when the ruling came down. They said the ruling will mean that more than ever, big spending economic interests will determine who gets elected. More money will especially pour into relentless attack campaigns. Free speech for most individuals will suffer because their voices will count for even less than they do now. They will simply be drowned out by the big money. The Providence Journal had a lot of foresight with that warning. What has happened since then has proven them right. Senator John McCain recently said, "I predicted when the United States Supreme Court, with their absolute ignorance of what happens in politics, struck down," he was referring to the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, "that there would be a flood of money into campaigns not transparent, unaccounted for, and this is exactly what is happening." Senator McCain, is it ever? In the 2010 midterm elections, the first after Citizens United, there was more than a four-fold increase in expenditures from super PACs and other outside groups compared to 2006. With nearly three-quarters of political advertising coming from sources that were prohibited from spending money in 2006. Also, in 2010, 501c4 and C6 not-for-profit organizations spent more than $135 million in unlimited and secret contributions. This anonymous secret spending rose from 1% of outside spending in 2006 to 44% in 2010. We are already seeing the influence of money on the 2012 elections. Super PACs and other outside groups have spent around $140 million in this election cycle. That's about twice what was spent over the same period in 2008 during the last presidential election. In the 2 weeks leading up to Super Tuesday, outside PACs that supported the Republican presidential candidate spent 3 times as much on advertising as the campaigns did themselves. There are already signs that things are going to get even worse. As reported by the Washington Post, groups that do not reveal their funding sources have spent $28.5 million on advertising related to the November presidential matchup, or about 90% of the total. 90%. And these groups that don't reveal their funding sources. Our campaign finance system is broken. Action is required to fix it. Americans of all political stripes are disgusted by the influence of unlimited anonymous corporate cash in our elections, and disgusted by campaigns that succeed or fail depending on how many billionaires the candidates have in their pockets. More and more, people feel that their government responds only to wealthy and corporate interests as they see their jobs disappear and their wages stagnate, and bailouts and special deals for the big guys, they lose ever more faith that their elected officials are actually listening to them. And over the deafening roar of secret special interest spending, they get harder and harder to listen to. This growing consensus across the political spectrum was reflected in the brief that Senator John McCain and I filed with the Supreme Court last week in American Tradition Partnership versus Bullock. In that brief, we urged the court to reconsider the flawed central premise of its decision in Citizens United, the proposition that independent expenditures do not lead to corruption or the appearance of corruption. As the statistics about anonymous spending and public perception that I've cited make clear, this premise is discredited. I'm proud to have worked on the brief with Senator McCain, who has long been a leader in Congress on campaign finance issues. And I hope that our partnership will mark the beginning of greater cooperation across party lines on this issue of vital importance to the integrity of our great American democracy. I also hope that the Supreme Court will take heed of the nearly universal opinion that the system that they've unleashed in Citizens United puts our very democracy in jeopardy. Until the court acts, or until we enact a constitutional amendment to repair what they have done, we are left with one weapon in the fight against the overwhelming tidal wave of money from special interests, and that is disclosure. At least make them fess up to who they are. That's why I stand here today in support of the DISCLOSE Act of 2012. As I said, DISCLOSE 2.0 in recognition of Senator Schumer's great work with the first DISCLOSE Act. This legislation will shine a bright light on these powerful interests and their spending. With this legislation, which now has 43 co-sponsors in the Senate, every citizen will know who is spending these great sums of money to get their candidates elected and to influence those candidates. Particular thanks to the previous presiding officer when I began, Senator Franken, the current presiding officer, Senator Tom Udall, as well as Senators Chuck Schumer, Michael Bennet, Jeff Merkley, and Jeanne Shaheen for their hard work on developing this legislation. Senator Schumer, as we all know, has been leading the charge for disclosure since Citizens United upended and fouled our campaign finance system. In 2010, with Senator Schumer's leadership, we came within one vote of passing the original DISCLOSE Act. And since then, the problem of anonymous, unaccountable special interest money has become much, much worse. We must redouble our efforts and pass DISCLOSE 2.0. DISCLOSE 2.0 says two very simple things. First, if you're an organization such as a corporation, a super PAC, a 501c4, and you're spending money in an election campaign in support of or in opposition to a candidate, you have to tell the public where that money came from and what you are spending it on in a timely manner. That should not be a controversial idea to anyone, at least to anyone who's not seeking secret special influence. This chart shows how easy it is under our current system for wealthy interests to anonymously spend millions on election ads. This amounts to a form of legalized money laundering or identity laundering. Super PACs are supposed to disclose their donors under current law, but if you want to avoid that disclosure, you can just set up a shell corporation, which may be nothing more than a P.O. box, and send the money to the super PAC through that. Or, worse still, instead of using a shell corporation, you can pass the money through to a 501c4 so-called social welfare organization, set up just for that purpose of spending money in elections. Think about that. The IRS gives nonprofit status to groups whose primary purpose in many cases is to shield billionaires and corporations spending money in elections from having their identities disclosed. In many cases, these 501c4 groups are so closely affiliated with their super PACs that they have all the same staff, all the same office space, and the C4 groups still don't have to disclose the identities of their donors. On this chart, we see the money raised through the end of 2011 by two political groups started after Citizens United by Republican political operatives. These two organizations have the same staff and the same office space, and they run negative ads against many of the same candidates. One, American Crossroads, is a super PAC and is supposed to disclose its donors. The other, Crossroads GPS is a 501c4 group and doesn't have to disclose donors. Guess which one has raised more money? Of course, it's the 501c4 group, which doesn't have to disclose its donors. That group has raised $76.8 million as compared to only $46.4 million by its sister super PAC. This is no unique situation. For corporations trying to buy influence through spending in elections, quote, non-disclosure is always preferred, close quote, as an unnamed corporate lobbyist recently told Politico. Why? Well, for one thing, there's no accountability, not to the company's shareholders, not to their customers, and not to the public. Non-disclosure is, quote, preferred because it makes it impossible for the public and for law enforcement to track the corrupting influence of the money that these corporations spend in elections. Disclose 2.0 would put an end to using 501c4 groups and shell corporations to shield the identities of big campaign contributors. One thing that shouldn't be lost in this discussion of anonymous spending is the fact that there is one person to whom this spending is virtually certainly not anonymous, and that's the candidate. That's the elected official. The donors manage to hide their identities from the public, but they can sure tell the candidate how much money they put in to that candidate's super PAC and what positions they want the candidate to take on issues. What this creates is a perfect formula for corruption. Wealthy corporations and individuals spending millions of dollars to influence a candidate without any oversight or public accountability or scrutiny. Also, as a former Attorney General, I know that the presiding officer can appreciate this as well. A well-heeled donor doesn't have to make the contribution necessarily, doesn't have to launch the ad necessarily. They can also secretly threaten a massive expenditure against a candidate if the candidate doesn't vote right on their issue. Political scientist Norm Ornstein recently said, quote, I've had this tale told to me by a number of lawmakers. You're sitting in your office and a lobbyist comes in and says, I'm working with Americans for a better America. And I can't tell you who's funding them, but I can tell you they really, really want this amendment in this bill. And who knows what they'll do? They've got more money than God. If the candidate complies and does the right thing by the amendment or the right thing by the bill, the expenditure is never made. There'll be no paper trail, no trace that that threat that drove a vote, that corrupted that vote, was ever made. The whole rationale for unlimited spending was that it was going to be done independently of the candidate's campaign. That has proven false. The reality is that super PACs are anything but independent. Campaigns and super PACs share fundraising lists, donors, former staff, consultants. Candidates appear at fundraisers for their super PACs, and super PACs recycle ads originally run by the candidates. They are free to act as the, quote, evil twins of candidate campaigns, as one FEC commissioner put it, raising unlimited anonymous money and then spending it on massive amounts of advertising, most of it negative, which further hides the identity of the interest behind the ad, because if all you're doing is trashing a candidate, you don't have to even show what your interest is, let alone what your identity is. About 70% of ads in this election cycle have, as a result, been negative ads, up from only 9% in 2008. This brings us to the second thing that Disclose 2.0 does. If you're a top executive or a major donor of an organization spending millions of dollars on campaign ads, you have to take responsibility for your ad, just the way we do as candidates. These are reasonable provisions that should have wide support from Democrats and Republicans alike. As Trevor Potter, a Republican former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, said in a statement submitted to the Rules Committee of the Senate, Disclose 2.0 is, quote, appropriately targeted, narrowly tailored, clearly constitutional and desperately needed. We have made every effort to craft an effective and fair proposal while imposing the least possible burden on covered organizations. Passing this law would remove a dark cloud of unlimited anonymous money from our elections, and it would prove to the American people that Congress is capable of fairness, equality, and following the fundamental principle of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I urge my colleagues to support the DISCLOSE Act of 2012, and I yield the floor